Okay, so I'm just going to let this clip play. It's about a couple minutes long. This is a clip of just raw footage that Hector and I got the day of the campfire as we came up from Sacramento. I'm just going to, I think you guys should really kind of just hear it. We're going to have her turn the volume up fairly loud. I really want you to feel like what it was like for us and just kind of get that visceral experience. Imagine smoke in the air. You know, your eyes are watering from it. You don't know what you're going into. I just would like you, just go for it, play it. Doesn't that wind just make your heart race? Can you feel that? And just the smoke and everything just in your face, and that's what we were going into that morning. So my name is Ryan Sabalow. I'm a reporter with the Sacramento Bee. I've spent a large part of my 15-year journalism career covering wildfires burning in Northern California, often close enough to feel the heat on my face and be speckled by the pink fire retardant dumped from airplanes. But 2018 was a fire season unlike any I've ever covered before. In my paper's coverage area, 2 massive wildfires burned communities that hold special places in my heart. I spent weeks covering both of them. Now, please keep in mind, I haven't done much public speaking since college, and I'm rusty. And honestly, I'm a crybaby, and even a year later, this remains a really emotional subject for me. I'm probably going to get choked up. I'm getting choked up now. And I ask that if you have any questions, you just hold them till the end, and we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A. First, I'd like to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about me and the areas that I enjoy covering. I grew up here in Siskiyou County near the Oregon border. Only 43,000 people live inside this county, which is 6,300 square miles across. My hometown of Mount Shasta is 150 or so miles from Paradise and about a 3.5-hour drive north of here. As some of you may know, this part of California tends to be extremely conservative in its politics. Less Nancy Pelosi, more Cliven Bundy. Okay, now because this picture makes me happy, this is where I grew up. That's Mount Shasta. That's my dog. And this is in one of our favorite hunting spots in Mount Shasta in the state of Jefferson. Now, I love talking about the state of Jefferson. For those of you who don't know, there is a super serious group of folks who want to secede from California and form a new state called Jefferson. Never mind that that's probably never going to happen. Now, this is the state flag of Jefferson, and those double X's stand for, we was double-crossed. Okay? All right. That's no joke. That's what it stands for. Now, all right, so sure, giggle, roll your eyes, but understand the sentiment. These places are about as different from Hollywood and Sacramento and San Francisco as you can imagine. Ranching, tourism, and of course that government that these folks don't care for very much are some of Jefferson's primary employers. Now, the timber industry used to be. This is important. And there's a lot of resentment in these areas about how we're letting the woods burn instead of making money off them like we used to in the timber industry's heyday. Now, I understand where these folks are coming from. That's my Uncle Keith, right there on the left, and that's my grandpa, Ace Salmon. And yes, Ace Salmon was Grandpa's real name. And yes, these two guys were as tough as they looked. Before he died a couple summers ago, Grandpa and I took some deer hunting trips together. We drove around old logging roads that Grandpa had cut decades earlier into the national forest. And he'd tell me these incredible stories about how he knocked down a tree full of hornets and got stung 1,000,000 times, or that time he got whacked in the head and got knocked unconscious by a piece of metal that fell off a logging rig, or that time that Keith actually fell on his chainsaw and had to hold his guts in while Grandpa drove him to the hospital. He also told me some crazy fire stories, including one of him outrunning a bulldozer in a canyon so steep he was practically standing on the bulldozer's instrument panels. Now, many of those woods we drove through have burned in the last few summers. And as I'm sure you all know, it's been brutal. That's my same hunting spot I just showed you. This was a cloudless summer morning a couple years ago, and that's not fog, that's smoke. I show this to you to reiterate the point about why some of these people in these areas resent having to breathe their local forests instead of sending them to the mills. As you probably figured out by now, I didn't inherit Grandpa Ace's logging abilities. I'm way too awkward and uncoordinated. I actually have a 40-stitch gash on my left thigh on one of the few times my dad actually let me use a chainsaw. A couple centimeters deeper, and I probably would have bled to death. So, as I was choosing careers, I figured riding a desk in some newsroom would be safer than following in Grandpa Ace's footsteps. The last few years haven't felt that way. So this was me the day after the campfire tore through paradise. Hector and I were out looking at the places where first responders found bodies. Hector snapped this as we hitched a ride back to our car in a state game warden's pickup. He was patrolling the closed disaster area looking for looters and others who weren't supposed to be in the disaster zone. And no, this game warden isn't escorting us out under the threat of arrest. In California, unlike some other states, credentialed journalists have basically unfettered access to natural disaster areas, including fire zone. Even if flames are burning all around us, there are no escorts. Public information officers at these big fires are almost always at some command center miles away from the fire line. They usually give out just 2 briefings, once in the morning and once in the evening. So to get the news our readers depend on right now, we have to go find it. Which is why we drive around with these in our windows. On the back is Penal Code Section 409.5. You see that bold type at the bottom? It says they can't keep us out of a disaster zone. Now, most of the time, the placards get us past the cops manning the checkpoints, keeping the rest of the public out. I say most of the time because there's always that one cop who doesn't know the law and won't let you pass, or there's that one guy who just wants to give an enemy of the people a hard time. So rather than argue, I've learned it's faster and easier just to find a cop at another checkpoint who lets you through. But before they let you pass, the cops almost always give you a lecture about how dangerous it is, as if we couldn't see the giant orange swirling mushroom cloud we're about to drive into. Now, speaking of swirling fireballs, this is the one that burned more than 1,000 homes in the city I lived in for 6 years. That right there is a massive vortex of flame and ash that formed in July during the Carr Fire in Redding. Later, scientists would call it a pyrogenetic tornado. Everyone else called it a fire-nado. They estimated its gusts blew at least 143 miles per hour. Now, that's the same intensity as a mid-sized tornado in the Midwest. The flaming whirlwind killed a bulldozer operator cutting fire lines. It killed a city fire inspector who was helping make sure the area was cleared of evacuees. Now, I haven't read his autopsy report, but the state fire agency says he died from traumatic injuries. I'm guessing that means he was pummeled to death by the same winds that dented this nearby pickup truck, broke its windows, and actually pushed it several feet. The firefighters inside that rig somehow survived. Now, while all this was going on that evening of July 26, I didn't realize how bad things had gotten. I ended my shift thinking the Carr Fire was just a normal Redding fire. Temperatures there regularly top 110 degrees, and the chaparral that surrounds the city burns constantly. The police scanner in my former Redding newsroom, where I worked for 6 years, chattered all summer about fires, a couple acres here, a couple acres there. Homes burn almost every year, sometimes a handful at a time, usually in the rural lots that cut into the brush that surrounds the city. But I realized how bad it was when I started seeing my friends and family members who live in the urban areas of Western Redding saying on social media they'd been ordered to evacuate. I packed up my fire gear and a few changes of clothes and headed the 2.5 hours north. I didn't get there until well after dark. I headed to interview evacuees at the local community college, which was being used as a Red Cross shelter. I'll never forget how surreal it was talking to them as ash fell under the fluorescent lights. It looked like snow. By the time I got finished editing, filing video, and writing, it was 2 a.m. I ended up sleeping for a couple of hours on a buddy's couch, but he wasn't there. He was at his dad's place behind the evacuation lines, ready to put out any fires that blew onto the property. Like many folks, they chose not to evacuate. Now, I don't know how common this is in other parts of California, but in the mythical state of Jefferson, it's pretty routine for folks to ignore an official government order. These are the folks we normally interview inside of a disaster area. It can be interesting, rolling up on a house that looks like this. Now, surprisingly, I rarely have anyone give me guff. Most of the time, folks talk to me. They give me great quotes and color for our stories like this. This is the guy who made this sign. Anyway, the next morning in Redding, I grabbed a cup of coffee from one of the few shops with power, and I headed out to try to fight the fire. I knew it was bad when I saw this. Now, that clip goes on for about a minute. There were dozens and dozens of fire trucks. And I didn't know it at the time, but they were escorting either one or both of the bodies of the bulldozer operator and the fire inspector who had died the evening before. I rendezvoused with Hector, who's sitting back there, and we made the drive up from Sac that morning. We headed into some of the neighborhoods that were still burning. Okay, now I have to give my shout out to the photographers. So a word about these photographers, like Hector, who is bragging here in this picture about an ember burn on a shirt he got covering the campfire. I'm just going to say this, I am a coward, all right? I hate going in solo behind the fire lines, but my courage increases exponentially when I'm with guys like him. When you work with these guys who are super experienced like Hector, I almost always ask them to drive because they're absolutely fearless and they've covered dozens of these things during the course of their career. Of course, sometimes I have to tell them that they're scaring the living hell out of me, okay? That happened a couple times at the Carr Fire when Hector took me down roads that had trees burning on both sides, or once when it was so smoky, I was worried we'd either hit an emergency vehicle we couldn't see or the staff car would actually stop running from lack of oxygen. When I couldn't see the hood, I was like, dude, let's turn around. They don't pay us enough to, die. So now, despite him scaring me once in a while, I'd take a bullet for Hector. He's a great guy and one of the hardest working people I know. Most photographers are. But sadly, Hector is no longer with the Bee. He took a job at UC Davis. Almost all of the experienced photojournalists I have worked with in my career have either quit, took buyouts, or were laid off. Now, this is the only time I will make this pitch in my talk, but you need to know that newsrooms across the country are struggling. We are at a crisis point, and we need help from the communities we serve. Amen. We need your subscriptions, and we need your charitable donations. Well, all of you subscribe, and I thank you, each and every one of you, for that. Far too many of our fellow citizens assume that news should be free, but good journalism costs money. And look at these haunting images that Hector captured at the Carr Fire. I really don't think a couple bucks a week on a subscription is too much to ask to support this kind of work. This is all ready. All right, now about this goat. His name is Milkshake. Hector and I found Milkshake while we were touring one into the neighborhoods that burned down. I was actually shooting a live video at the time, and with hundreds of Facebook followers watching, I decided I was going to bring this goat some water and show the readers what a really swell guy I was. Of course, I lugged the water up there, and the goat didn't even drink it. And as I was walking back to the car, in the middle of my live feed, this happened. Now, pardon the poor quality. There was barely any cell service at the time. Now, in order to keep filming, I'm going to have to plug in a portable charger because this just drains your battery. So bear with me once we get to the car. Good, damn it. It's got stung by a bee. Ow. Awesome, right on the neck. Ow. That's going to be fun. That's going to swell up. Damn it. Sorry for swearing. Damn hornet just got me right on the neck. See the bump? The good news is I actually didn't swear all that much. And one of the viewers happened to recognize Milkshake. And they called animal control, and he was reunited with his owners who had lost their home. Now, shortly after the Milkshake incident, we drove to the neighborhood where my wife and I had bought our first home in 2009. By that part of my career, I'd covered wildfires for the Record Searchlight for 3 years. I'd seen fire after fire ignite in Shasta County's blast furnace summers. In 2008, a freak early summer lightning storm ignited more than 86,000 acres in the area, prompting the evacuation of dozens of families. I stood in that very subdivision where we would later want to live as residents watched the churning smoke plume on the other side of the Sacramento River Canyon. The fire didn't jump the river that day. But as my wife Kara and I toured that same subdivision, I told her, this neighborhood is going to burn to the ground someday. We bought the home anyway. It's the California way to live with profound natural risks. It has been that way since Governor Leland Stanford famously took a rowboat to his inauguration not long after California became a state. At the time, Sacramento was underwater from the same floods that threatened to swamp this city that you're in right now every single wet winter, and it's going to happen at some point. We Californians have built and built and built on floodplains. We have built over fault lines. We have built under volcanoes. We have built in places where there is no water, right? And we have built in fire zones. So it wasn't a surprise that my prediction was proven right. My apologies, this video runs just a touch too long.
All right, so we're driving now into the neighborhood where I lived for 3 years. We bought a house. You can see that much of the neighborhood has been burned down. Holy smokes. Sorry.
I want to drive down there real quick.
Yeah, that's where, if we can go, I'd like to do like to see. So my street was Winchell Drive, which, let's see. Let's see. My goodness. Menlo Way and Winchell Drive. My house was right up here. Let's see if it's still standing.
Where's your hard hat?
That's Hector harassing another journalist. That's what he does.
So turn up here on Winchell, if you won't mind. I want to see if my house is still there. This isn't Winchell, it's the next one up. Looks like it might have made it. It looks like the fire maybe didn't come this far. Go that way. Alright, now it's been 3-4 years since I've been here.
What I
Turn
find
right
interesting
here.
about this,
Balboa.
see
Balboa.
there's certain
Sorry.
houses that are
Man, it's been a long
standing,
time.
and then there'll be just a random house that's burned down. And that's from the way embers can get into attics.
Oh no.
Like
So
your
that
house
house
is gone, while
didn't
everything
make
else
it.
around
It's
it-
amazing how turn on Winchell right here and see if ours has still made it, and my neighbor Gail. The old house still made it.
That's my house right there.
There it is right there. That's where we live. And that's Gail's house over here. All right. Thank you, Hector.
So those awkward pauses and sentences half said were me trying not to get emotional. I was really struggling. Those burned streets was where I walked our puppy and I pushed our girls in strollers. We sold that home some years back when I changed newspaper jobs, but I still miss it. It was a nice little neighborhood. A lot of those homes were owned by large families of Southeast Asian immigrants. They were excellent neighbors who regularly held feasts and let me come over and eat their great food. There are some killer running trails that take you down to the Sacramento River right there, and some of the best fishing in Northern California is just minutes away. If we still own that place, I would want to live there, despite the fire risk that I know will grow back as soon as that chaparral pops back up. And it will, no matter how much folks like Trump's Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke would like to say that logging alone would solve California's fire problem. Here's Ryan Zinke touring my old neighborhood after the fire was well out. The day he came to Redding, he claimed that if only the environmentalists would have let the timber industry log, infernos like the Carr Fire wouldn't keep happening. It played extremely well in the conservative state of Jefferson, whose timber industry is a shadow of what it once was before the spotted owl. But there were a few factual problems. For one thing, there's a surprising amount of consensus among environmental groups, the timber industry, and scientists about using chainsaws to restore California's overgrown, drought-plagued forests. And for another thing, and this is probably the most important one, there is next to no marketable timber in the chaparral that burned into a firenado west of Redding. It's all just brush, spindly oaks, and a few knobby pines that the mills do not want. Now, sure, they might have been able to do a better job cutting fire breaks in the chaparral around town to protect the community. And the state announced early this year that they'll be doing some of that sort of thinning in the areas that didn't burn around Redding. But in much of California, there isn't enough biomass power plants and other processing facilities to handle the brush and the small trees that they need to cut to fully fireproof the dozens and dozens of cities that, just like Redding, encroach heavily into what's known as the wildland-urban interface. Plus, maintaining a fire break requires constant vigilance, kind of like mowing your lawn. Who pays for that over the coming decades? My prediction is that in a few years, the vegetation around my old neighborhood will grow back, and the brush will burn again in the coming decades. And maybe that neighborhood will too. It's what the state wants to do. UC Berkeley researchers estimate that prior to 1800, about 4.5 million acres of California burned in a typical year. That's more than double last year's record-breaking fire season. And that was before we started monkeying with our climate and infesting our wild places with non-native fire-prone vegetation. That was before we spent a century trying to put out every fire that popped up to protect the state's lucrative timber stocks and the ever-expanding urban sprawl. In other words, California has always been a fire trap, and it always will be. Of course, the fact-checking and the in-depth stories I would write would come after the stressful, exhausting, emotionally draining breaking news. And my final day at the Carr Fire was by far the hardest. I get choked up just seeing that picture. Hector took this photo outside the Shasta County Sheriff's Office after we'd been at it for days. That's a mother whose 2 children burned to death with their grandmother, not far from my former home. He's partially hidden behind those women, but the man in the black hat is those kids' grandfather. Months later, I could still hear his big, gulping baritone sobs. I'm really glad another of our reporters there was to do the interviews because I couldn't keep it together. His sobs absolutely wrecked me. They let me go home, thankfully, after I filed that story. And everything I owned stunk like smoke and stress and sweat and sadness. I was fried. Now, I thought that would be the worst fire I'd have to cover that year, but California's fire season wasn't done, not by a long shot. On November 8th, I remember scraping frost off my windshield before heading to the office. A big fire was the last thing I expected to cover that day. I should have known better. Every summer, California goes through a drought that would cripple other parts of the country. It doesn't rain from basically May to November. That morning, the North State was as brittle and as dry as it possibly could be, and the wind was howling. When I got to work, my social media feed began blowing up about a big fire in Paradise. I dug out the fire gear I'd stowed since the Carr Fire when I saw the shot taken from the office of the newspaper in Chico, the city that sits in the valley just below Paradise. My wife's family lives in that part of Butte County. We met in college in Chico. We're constantly up there with our daughters visiting their grandparents. So twice in just a few months, I was covering infernos, threatening the places where my friends and loved ones lived. I first stopped at one of the evacuation shelters to grab some quotes from folks who'd fled to the outlying towns. You saw those clips in the video I played for you earlier showing what it actually looked and felt like when Hector and I finally made it to Paradise that afternoon. Now, we had heard the hospital was on fire, and we were making our way to it, to the skeletons of all these melted cars and all these fallen tree limbs and all these down power lines, when we saw an animal Ugh, this is going to be tough to talk about too. Trying to walk bow-legged on burned feet. Its hair was gone, and its flanks were burned. It took us even a few seconds to figure out what it was. After a little bit, I saw it was a raccoon, and it was completely blind. The fire had torched its eyes. Now, I'm a hunter, so I know a dying animal when I see it. There was no water, no one was coming to help, and it couldn't see. So I told Hector to stop. I had no gun, so I grabbed this water bottle to use as a club, and I took out my pocket knife. I got out, walked up to it, and I told the raccoon I was sorry. The dent tells the story of what happened next. The raccoon's suffering was over, and I was wiping tears from my eyes. But there was no time to process what had happened. We still had work to do, and we had to get to that hospital to see if it was still there. I took this shot the next morning along the meandering road we drove to get there. That stuff pouring off the truck is aluminum. The heat was so intense, it melted the rims on the wheels. You see that crime scene tape there on the window frame? That's how the coroner would later flag the vehicles they'd remove bodies from. There were maybe a half dozen of those cars on tape with them, or that had tape on them. So on that first afternoon, after the raccoon, I'm really glad I didn't look too close to what was inside the cars we drove past. After reporting that first day, we stopped as the sun was going down so Hector could file the last of his videos and photos in the one place that had cell service. There were a few other reporters parked along the side of the road. The fire was still burning pretty hard, and the wind was still blowing, but I decided we really needed to go when I saw this dozer chugging past us as fast as it could go. So that first night, the fire threatened my wife's family in Chico. I actually did a live Facebook video, Firefighters in the Dark, setting backfires to protect the neighborhood where my kids' grandparents live. On the way there, I was calling my brother-in-law, telling him to get his kids out. They live in Durham, which is a little bit south of Chico. Thankfully, none of Kara's immediate family lost their homes, but her nephew's dad lost his in Paradise, and a number of our family friends did too. Meanwhile, the stories my colleagues and I were collecting were terrifying. The fire blew through so hot and so fast, some people had to swim out in a lake as flames roared overhead. After evacuating patients, nurses and doctors who fled the hospital ended up trapped in their cars. They were calling their children, telling them they were about to die. They told them that they loved them. This is Dorothy Burns and her dog, Smokey. She drove off a retaining wall and smoke so thick she couldn't see her car's hood, let alone the exit to her subdivision. She and Smokey would have died there, high-centered with her wheels spinning, if not for her neighbor, Brandon Hill. I wish I had a picture of him. You should see this guy. He's got this big beard, and he's this poor guy. He picked her up by her poofy jacket and tossed her in his car. He grabbed Smokey, too, and took them to his mom's place. There, Brandon and his neighbor spent that first day putting out spot fires. They cared for Dorothy and a hypothermic old man they had to rescue from an island in the middle of a lake. That story, told to me in the days after the fire, hit me really hard. My grandmother lives alone in a trailer park in Mount Shasta. It's a similar Northern California mountain town that could burn at any day. She looks an awful lot like Dorothy. She even has a little dog. I imagined her brother, my increasingly frail great-uncle, forced to jump into the creek near his house to escape any one of the fires that could ignite in the tinder-dry foothills outside his El Dorado County home. Brandon Hill's story hit so close to home, I did something I've never done with a source. I called his mom at the local county office. I told her that she should be proud. I told her that she raised a good son. Now, some of the most difficult stories to hear when covering these fast-moving fires are those told by the families who are unable to grab their animals in the frantic minutes their homes are catching fire. Dogs, cats, goats like Milkshake freak and bolt because of the sirens and the smoke and the flames and the shouting. At the campfire, I ended up having a role in one of these lost pet stories. One afternoon, I was driving through Paradise looking for cell phone reception to send some stuff back to the office when I spotted the silhouette of a cat's ears poking out from one of the few unburned cars I drove past. I hit the brakes. I barely crawled under the car and saw a calico with striking blue eyes. Her hair on one side was singed down to the skin. Her whiskers were burned down to pitiful little nubs. I tried to coax her out with water in the bowl I keep in my pickup for my dog. But the poor thing wanted a human's touch more than a drink after days of terror and pain. I grabbed her by the nape of her neck and pulled her out. I carried her in my arms to my truck.
I'll get you home. I'll get you to the shelter. Come on. You'll be okay.
I posted this short video on Twitter before I raced her to a Chico vet clinic that was doubling as a pet rescue center. Inside, families were leafing through a binder filled with pictures of animals that had been dropped off from the fire zone. Many of them left with tears in their eyes. Their search was fruitless. There wasn't anything else I could do, so I dropped off the cat and wished for the best. Thankfully, Lynn Martin spotted my post after someone shared it on a Facebook group for lost fire pets. I met her and her husband, Christopher, later that day in Chico. They told me they lost their home, and they told me that cat's name is London. That evening, Lynn sent me this photo. She told me London was purring. It made all the hard work, the fear, the sadness, and the stress from that 2018 fire season feel just a little bit better.